First of all, it's great to be back here. This is so essentially I'm here because I know I've written this book of counsel, and I know people ask why I've written this book, and part of it, of course, began as just wanting to put down all that I had done, with my team, which was not in the economic surveys or other things that I did. So it's kind of a compilation. But then, as I started compiling it, I felt that I had to, kind of almost get some unfinished business out of my system, and that's why, I wrote about, the whole, history of what went wrong in the banking system. So I had some ideas which I wanted to get out of my system. So I think after this, I'm not going to be obsessed with India for some time.
Okay. I think we'll start with demonetization, which has caught up the attention. I think one of the most controversial areas, and you spoke about it being draconian, massive monetary shock. What do you think? I mean, do you think it was a worthy move?
I really felt that there were two things that I learned about demonetization. And so I offer the fairly controversial hypothesis, which of course I'd like to discuss, is that actually imposing a lot of costs on a lot of people was intrinsic to its political success. That's very controversial. And because I draw out of it a political economy lesson, which I think I kind of believe more and more, that when you have, charismatic leaders, kind of retail politicians, it's easier to take action which affects many than it is to take on narrow vested interests. It's proved difficult to take on large farmers. It's proved difficult to take on, whatever fertilizer industry lobbies. It's proved difficult to take on public sector unions. But apparently, it's not difficult to impose costs on the entire informal sector. Second question is this whole draconian thing, right? See, remember that I posed it as puzzle number 2, which is the following. I called the 86% monetary shock, draconian. You may call it severe. In the survey, by the way, we call it a large structural shock, which was kind of, you may call it draconian, you may call it severe, extreme. I think that I really doesn't, matter at all, because the point is 86% you take away. It's not soft, it's not small, it is massive. It was meant to be massive. I think we have to accept that. But the puzzle for me reflecting upon this was, you take away 86% and you look at the measured GDP impact, it's completely, you can't see it in the data. Now and I remember having breakfast with Paul Krugman, discussing this. You talk, and I've also discussed this with Ken Rogoff and Jeff Frankel. I mean, they're all astounded that how is it that you take away 86% cash and, maybe growth from, from 7.5%. We don't know exactly how much went down, but it's also affected by other factors. I mean, everyone would have predicted a probably negative growth actually based on this.
Can you elaborate more on these costs? I mean, you're almost ascribing some kind of a masochist tendency. I mean, people like to be inflicted pain.
No,
I mean, is it for some kind? I mean, definitely there's no pleasure in pain unless one sees the other way.
So I think, I think there are a series of related ideas on that, Harisha. One is that, you see, remember, one explanation was that, you wanted to show that you were against black money, right? My answer to that is that if you only wanted to go after the corrupt rich, you had other instruments that could target the corrupt rich. Why also kind of, affect the many in order to go? So the collateral cost is very huge if you want to just go after the rich. So it has to be more than that, right? And my explanation is that, 2 or 3 explanations. If imposing a lot of costs on a lot of people first has a signaling effect that, if you feel pain, you think, oh, that other guy must also be suffering pain. That's one. Second is the sense of shared sacrifice, that, all of us are in this together. But I think probably the most important thing, for me, very important, is that if the impact is partial, then all these doubts arise about, who was left out? Why were they left out? Was it because of something? So this way, none of that, just across the board.
So certainly when the demonetization happened, one remembering talking to several officials in PMO and Finance Ministry, one got an impression that they did expect almost 2 to 3 lakh crore worth currency not to come back to the system, and probably that could be used for better purposes. Was that the sense you also got? And finally, eventually, when it so happened that 99% of the money came back, you thought it was expected?
All these calculations were all done ex post, right? I mean, what the ex ante calculations were, I have no clue. But I think I just want to say 2 or 3 things on this. I think it is fair to say that probably there was an expectation that some amount, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 lakh crores, 5 lakh, whatever it is, would not come back, right? But I think obviously if it hadn't come back, I think you could have said that some serious wealth destruction happened, which affected probably the corrupt rich. Of course, that didn't happen. But the fact that all this came back does not necessarily mean that costs were not imposed on the corrupt rich, right? The cost could have been imposed either because they had to launder it and had to pay a cost to launder it, right? The cost could also happen because they had to declare it and had to pay taxes on it. So what the net costs that were imposed on the corrupt rich in reality versus what was anticipated, we don't know. Because money comes back and yet costs could have been I mean, the standard way being you had to pay 25-30% to launder the money, and so that is a kind of a Robin Hood kind of tax, even though the money comes back. So I think that so that calculation finally it's very difficult to say.
Expectations from the government in terms of it will deliver high growth, it will deliver high jobs. But now it seems that crossing 7% has become a big hurdle, and a lot of people are calling it the new Hindu rate of growth. What do you think has gone wrong?
See, I think that to me, I mean, there were several things, but I think I would pinpoint 3 reasons why, growth has behaved the way it is, right? One, I think, is the financial sector. I think the cleanup of the financial sector took a long time, and it's still completely a work in progress. I mean, we had this amazing IBC enacted, but 2018 has made us realize that the problem is far from solved, and actually new problems have emerged. So the financial system is still not in a position to finance investment because, I mean, the cleanup both of the corporates and the banks, 8 to 9 years on, has only just begun. I've actually looked at agricultural growth over the last 50 years. Surprisingly, the highest kind of long period of agricultural growth was actually in that period, about 2003, 4 to 7, 8, about 3.5%, because there was a massive global agricultural commodity boom, which benefited India enormously. In the last few years, I mean, agriculture has gone the other way. And remember, it's gone the other way in surprising. We had droughts in the first 2 years. And in the next 2 years, we've had good production. But for a variety of reasons, farm income prices have basically collapsed outside the cereal sector. So agriculture has been a drag on growth. The third thing, of course, is exports. I think that, Sajid Chinoy has written on this. It's something that we wrote about in the surveys as well, that a flip side of low oil prices was that you had this huge capital inflow, the exchange rate appreciated by 20%, we lost competitive by 20%, world economy went down, so our manufacturing export growth and our services export growth were, not even remotely as buoyant as they used to be.
Taking you back to demonetization, just 2 quick questions. A, were you consulted before the announcement was made?
See, as I've said very, very clearly, this is not a kiss and tell memoir. That is about, who knew what when is for the gossip columnists and the Twitter trollers, and so I will leave it to that. See, I think when demonetization was announced, I think as an economist, I was, trying to just, understand, all its complexity, what the costs were going to be, how much, what the potential benefits were going to be. So there was, as I say in the book very honestly, there was also for me a lot of honest learning about how it might pan out. I mean, one kind of knew that the impact on the informal sector was going to be substantial.
Sir, to a related topic, GST, while you talked about the political impact of demonetization and how it not get reflected in the electoral thing. Recent reports from the elections, whether Harish or Ravish or all my colleagues who have reported, have said that GST is a big grouse with the small trader, with the MSME sector. In fact, today's page one has a report from Chennai, which says that the MSME Manufacturers Association survey shows GST as a huge grouse. Are you happy with the GST that eventually got rolled out? Why was not as simple as it was expected to be? And despite the political impact on a constituency which is seen as the ruling party's national constituency, why have we not been able to fix it?
So the first thing, let me say 3 or 4 things about the GST, right? First, I think that what was really kind of unusual was that there were 2, policy actions, shocks, draconian, whatever you want to call it, taken in quick succession that both pretty much impacted, nearly the same sector, the small informal sector. So, second, I think absolutely no question that had it been simpler, I think we might have avoided some of the things. You see, I think to be fair to the system that, once you can't have simplicity, then complex policy leads to maybe ultra complex procedures. So I think so. I don't know the kind of procedural side well enough, but because it became so complex, I suspect that how you design the IT, how you design the forms, it happened kind of late in the day. I think that kind of complicated matters. But I think to be fair, I think once the concerns about SMEs were expressed, I do think that in Guwahati, for example, in the Guwahati GST Council, a lot of measures were taken to simplify procedures for GST.
So, in the recent past, we have seen Solicitor General Ranjan Kumar, then from Niti Aayog se Arvind Subramanian, recently Richard Patel from RBI have quit citing personal reasons. Do you think it is difficult to work with the government? What could have been the reason that one after another is quitting the government or service, saying or citing, quoting personal reasons?
You know that I don't know anything about their situation at all. You see, my own, I also left for personal reasons, as you know. So, and see, I do think that, at least my term, I keep saying it's the best job I ever had, and I completely, swear by that. And, I had a dream boss, which also I swear by. And, I think that these are all positions that are going to be inherently quite, delicate positions. You're going to have views that are different from the government. So I think, each one has to find his or her own way of kind of navigating this kind of challenge between.
Sir, this is not a hard economic question. I cover BJP. I keep listening to them talking about, how the Modi government has changed the turn around the economy. And we have seen this Moody's report and ease of doing business, India is ranking. Is it really a rosy picture? Or, if it is a rosy picture, what has happened in the last 4.5 years that has made this picture so rosy?
See, the thing is that, again, in the book, I say that, there were, I think, some major achievements, right? And there were also some shortcomings, things that could have been done, things, that were not done. So I think I'm very, balanced in my, and I think the 3 big achievements I would say are, the GST for all its, I think needs to be improved. I think the bankruptcy code turned out to be the only possible way of beginning to resolve this problem. I advocated a bad bank early on. I think it's fair to say that I probably think that that may not have worked, because I think in India, and maybe at some time we should talk about this. I mean, the way the whole stigmatized capitalism has evolved, it's seeming more and more that tough decisions, even on the economy, especially when it comes to involving the private sector and forgiving debts, can only be taken by the judicial process. It's turning out to be the case, and given that, so the IBC was I think a major achievement. That's not to say that it's getting overloaded. I think there are complications. I think we need to do more on that. I think the RBI also is doing a lot on the resolution process, especially in the last 12 months, for which I think they deserve a lot of credit. So that's another big achievement. The third big achievement, I think I would say, and I was speaking to Harish before leaving, I think if you were to ask me what was distinctive about, in vision terms about the last government, I think it was this, I think, a kind of new welfarism, which, and I say you have to, it's very carefully stated as, the government providing, especially to the poor, using technology, essential private goods and services. So it's not handouts and welfare, it's not health and education necessarily, primary health and primary education. It is about providing toilets, it's about providing cooking gas, about rural housing, power, medical emergency, whatever. So these are all kind of essential private goods and services, but I think this is what I would say is quite distinctive about this.
So, so one of the promises when this government came to power was about creating 2 crore jobs, and that's being questioned now. But when you ask the government, or at least the party in power, they claim that there are jobs which are not being counted. Then there are mudra loans, so they are creating self-employment. Do you think there has been sufficient or satisfactory job growth in the country?
See, as I said earlier, look, there is really no hard basis for, making any claims about employment on one side or the other, right? I think what's fair to say, that's an honest answer, because as I said, the last good data was 2011, and all that has come out afterwards, all of this has some, major methodological, difficulty to be able to say this is reliable data. I mean, that one can feel really confident about this data. But what I would say is that I think there is a sense in which, this country requires a lot of job creation and opportunity creation. Maybe in the last 4 years that hasn't happened commensurate with that, maybe. But so I've always said that the reason why I think, the employment thing keeps coming up is that in the boom period, right, 3 sectors did very well. Agriculture, because of the commodity boom. Construction did very well because of the thing. And IT did very well because of that boom, right? These 3 sectors, let's be honest, in the last 4 years have not done, IT has shed jobs, agricultural farm incomes have languished, and the third, construction, has been, for all kinds of reasons, pretty, tepid in its growth.
It's still growing at 7%, even though, the things have changed for the country. And yet the back series data shows that, the rate of growth is lower than what it is right now, was lower. Do you trust the credibility of that data?
So I think, see, look, I want to say 2 or 3 very clear things about this. I'm not a statistician, and I haven't looked at the data, the backcasting. I know nothing about how it was done or whatever. But I think you have to be honest and say, from an economist perspective, just an economist perspective, if you look at a variety of indicators in that period, whether it's exports, credit, capital inflows. We forget capital inflows were 8 to 10% of GDP, investment, corporate profits. So you look at a variety of indicators in that period and this period. I mean, they were much higher in that period. So if despite all that we're saying GDP growth is about the same or a little bit whatever, it certainly invites a lot of questions. It's not something that one can easily accept at face value, because as an economist you kind of say, how is this possible? Something something quite unusual must be happening on productivity growth or whatever, which is unprecedented. So we don't want to be in a situation where, every time a number comes out, our institutions have gotten so, discredited that people start doubting every number that comes out. So I think we should never be in that position. So therefore, I think the only solution to that is we must have experts, because it's a very technical exercise. Experts and only experts, institutions having experts on this, adjudicate this and come out with their verdict.
So in recent months, we have seen there has been a tussle between the government and the RBI. And the government is learned to have invoked Section 7 of the RBI Act, which ultimately, is cited as one of the reasons for Urjit Patel's, resignation. As an chief economic advisor, had you been in the government now, would you have advised the government against invoking Section 7, or did it in any way undermine the autonomy of the RBI?
See, I don't know whether Section 7 was invoked or not invoked, but I do think that when you come, when you have to take extreme measures like that, it has the serious risk of actually, compromising the independence of an institution that is so revered and respected like the Indian RBI. And I've said very clearly that, this is an institution that deservedly has a good reputation, and we must not do anything to, encroach upon, some fundamental autonomy and thing. Including by, a Section 7 or politicizing the board. There are various ways you can do it. We must not just do it, and also the perception should not be there that anyone is trying to do that. But that being said, I think that we should also be mindful of the fact, and I say this in the book, that the RBI also needs to be held accountable for a lot of things. I think that, it seriously underestimated the magnitude of the problem. It was very late in getting to the problem. We've had, googlies coming out of nowhere like ILFS, which clearly should not have happened. How can a 90,000 crore behemoth, which is a systemically important institution, completely surprise everyone?
So, one question on this increasing trend of political parties announcing debt waivers ahead of elections. How do you see it as for the economy and for the banking system? Do you see it as a big challenge coming up? Because it is only going, everybody is just in a race to kind of announce it. So how do you see that for the economy and for the banking system overall?
You see, I think that, loan waivers are, I think, a very, very inefficient and not a very good instrument to achieve agricultural objectives. Even if you want to achieve agricultural objectives, say you can't achieve them by improving productivity very quickly, then even in terms of, providing a cushion, there are much better ways of doing it. Direct benefit transfers, the Telangana Raitu Bandhu scheme, because other schemes are more effective and they don't carry the kind of perverse incentives that loan waivers have. Loan waivers, remember that it penalizes those who don't borrow at all, i.e. those who don't borrow from the formal system. They're more likely to be those who borrow from the informal system, i.e. much worse off, and they are penalized relative to those who borrow from the finance system. Second, it penalizes those who borrow and repay. So, so I think the kind of incentives that you create for that, but I do think that when states are promising this, at least in principle, the center has control and saying, which is what I think the FM said when I was here, about 10 months ago, whatever, that if you want, when UP first announced it, you want to do it, you have a fiscal constraint because we control how much borrowing you can do. So if you want to give a loan waiver, you still have to meet the fiscal deficit FRL legislation. You will have to cut something else. So that's a way of saying that you have to bear the political cost of that and not transfer it elsewhere had you not had that constraint. So on the fiscal side, I think as long as the state government's doing it, if it then comes to central government level, then of course, then it becomes a much trickier business. But I think I would have a strongly urge, much better instruments now for achieving this, and loan waivers are a very problematic, very inefficient, very perverse way of achieving agricultural objectives.
For the RBI's surplus reserves transfer on that topic, earlier there was transfer once in a year, then the demand for interim transfers came in, then you flagged about how RBI has a high level of
excess reserve.
Yeah. So there is no defined global level as such, but also now that you have stressed that before elections at least, it should not be done for any other purpose except for capitalization of banks. But isn't that also a budget financing thing? Capitalization of banks. Also, if one does it once, it will keep on happening. Successive governments will dip into RBI's reserves for any purpose. So where does one draw the line?
See, I think that it's a very good question, and do we have a little bit of time? I want to, I want to kind of, explain this also to some extent. Thinking that I'm still a teacher and an economic advisor, maybe I'm deluded, but let me try and do. You see, first there's a technical question: are there excess reserves? Okay, and we just have an EPW paper as well, which hopefully you'll read. Unambiguously, there is excess reserves, and the if you apply international best practice on how much should be the optimal reserves, and applied, and that's what we did in the EPW paper, it is clearly, there's excess reserves. I think that's unambiguous. I have no doubts in that. But then there's the political policy question of what do you do about that, right? And that's why I want to say 3 or 4 things there. One, that because it is unusual, it should be therefore used very, very carefully. And when I said it should only be used for recapitalization, that captures the spirit that you can't do this again and again, and you can do it only for things that will have, important long-run consequences. You see, third, I think that, it should be done completely cooperatively and not unilaterally. And I said this in my first survey as well. But let me make this slightly more controversial pushback, which is what I say in the book as well. Look, that all over the world, especially after the global financial crisis, what distinguished central banks, ECB, Fed especially, they said, global financial crisis, very unusual, we are going to deploy our central bank balance sheet in order to address these one-off problems, right? And that took several forms in Europe, the ECB, kind of the collateral that they got against which they lent. So, but basically they said we will use our balance sheet. My, quibble with the RBI is that why did it never voluntarily say that? Why didn't it say at some point in time that, look, we have this strong balance sheet. Strong balance sheets are meant to be used. I mean, it is so strong that there is enough that you can use some without compromising the integrity. They could voluntarily have said, look, we actually proactively volunteer to put the RBI's balance sheet for solving the financial sector problem, but we will do so only under these conditions. If you, the government, did ABC. That could have been a completely different dynamic on this. It could have then, if the RBI is voluntarily doing it, there's no question of government raiding the RBI. So the whole dynamic would have been very different. So what I would like all of you to ponder about is think of it the other way. Think of it as not as government raiding the RBI, but why perhaps the RBI didn't behave differently. We should have made all these things about raiding everything completely moot. It could have changed the dynamic. And what I say is that, maybe the RBI missed a Draghi moment.
So, my question is back on GST again. The first one is that was the budget estimate too ambitious, because so far we've reached about an average monthly collection 97,000, we are falling short by 15,000 crore every month.
If the budget is demanding something much higher of the GST, then, I mean, you would have to kind of infer that, maybe the budget got ahead of, what were the underlying conditions in the economy. So I think it's a bit unfair to blame the GST revenue for targets that were set in the budget. And I think on the more appropriate benchmarks, I'm not sure, but I don't think the GST revenue is doing that badly.
So there is a lot of talk about changing the governance structure of the RBI. So do you think the current RBI board should be empowered more to have a more proactive role than the advisory role that it plays right now, or the decision-making process should be left with the RBI management?
See, actually, I don't know enough, but my sense is that the board is meant to be kind of big picture advisory, because all the operational stuff that needs to be done, there are expert committees on each of them, right? So my instinct, but I don't know enough, my instinct would be to keep the board kind of at that 30,000 feet level to give overall guidance and so on, and not kind of get involved in all the kind of details of this. That would be my instinct, yeah.
With the current mess in the banking that we are in, what proportion is from UPA and what proportion would you give? Because you were early on to suggest that we have to address this thing. So there was nothing
that it was not flagged off early on in the government. So what proportion is UPA's contribution? What proportion is the delay by the current government?
You see, and I'm not evading this, because you do need to look at numbers carefully in terms of the actual timing, loan by loan, of how these things evolved, right? And I don't think anyone has done that calculation. It requires really detailed data, to see, how much was being evergreened, when did the evergreening stop, when did new loans become, NPA. So it's not an evasion, but I would say that a predominant is legacy, and a smaller proportion is new. But it's absolutely impossible to say whether it's 70, 30, 80, 20, 60, 40, whatever. But because, as I say in the book, the original sin for the twin balance sheet problem was the excessive lending that took place in the boom years. That was the source of the problem. And so how much was then and how much later, it really would be impossible to say.
So is there a real threat of we becoming a very welfare oriented state as a whole, not just at the federal levels, but also at the smaller provincial levels? And then what about reforms then?
You see, that's a great question. I think we should remind ourselves that we've always been a very kind of welfarist country at the state level and the central level. In fact, in the last survey, and I think more and more I think about, there is, one could argue that there is a kind of democracy tax on Indian development, right? And that democracy tax is really about having to redistribute in many, many different ways, well beyond our capacity to do it historically. So I think that the way I think about it is that we are a democracy, wonderful democracy. Of course, we're not going to change that. But that means that there will always be pressures to redistribute, right? I think the challenge for us is to find efficient ways of redistributing. We know that subsidies are a very inefficient way of doing that, all kinds of price controls, and that's what creates a problem. I mean, agriculture, you have subsidies, fertilizer, water subsidies, the water table goes. We grow sugarcane in Maharashtra, whatever, right? So we want to get rid of those efficient, and I think more and more we should be thinking of much more non-distortionary ways, and that's where things like universal basic income, non-distortionary, direct benefit transfers, those companies, that has to be the way of the future, because in democracies we cannot not redistribute.
I think we'll wrap up here.
That was a long session. Huh?
Thank you.
Good, very good.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Huh?